Okay, so WEKH is part of the Women Entrepreneurship Strategy of the federal government. It's a cross-cutting strategy that aims to double the number of women entrepreneurs by 2025. So this is a tall order. This is an ambitious goal. And we'll talk about how entrepreneurship is defined as well, and in connection to that goal. So the government estimates that this will add, so doubling the number of women starting businesses and sustaining and scaling businesses will add $150 billion to the Canadian economy. And that figure is from the McKinsey report 2017, which I know many of you are familiar with. And the federal government has basically adopted those figures. I'm seeing Sarah Kaplan shake her head a little bit here, so we'll hear what she has to say about that afterwards. So the Women Entrepreneurship Strategy funds individual women entrepreneurs and the organizations that support them through a $2 million investment. WEKH is the platform for linking organizations together. And all of our work is informed by an intersectional lens. So we had a great conversation and a discussion about intersectionality yesterday. I learned a lot from many of your comments and the panelists, and this really informs everything that we do. So we're not only looking at women as an overall group, although of course it's important to look at that versus men. We're also looking at the diversity within those categories. It's very important. So WEKH has what we call a B2B focus. Our focus is on the organizations and networking the organizations and learning from them, both those that serve women and those who specifically serve women and those who fund women and don't fund women as much as we think that they should, so the more traditional financial institutions and others. Other players in the women's enterprise entrepreneurship strategy are dedicated as well to networking across women's organizations and as well to serving women, individual women entrepreneurs. That's not our job in WEKH. These things are our job here. So build a community of practice, which we're doing with events like this. Advance gender and diversity analysis to develop inclusive policies, programs, and practices. So clearly we do want to influence policy at different levels in government as well as organizational practice in what we call the innovation ecosystem. Developing a digital platform, so this is through Magnet, and I think you're going to hear from Mark later today, who is the head of Magnet. This is a very forward-looking digital platform that will connect women with available resources, and it also provides tools to connect supports and resources to reduce fragmentation in the system. Right? So there are a lot of supports in Canada. There are certainly more dollars going into women's entrepreneurship are needed, but both the research and the supports themselves and how they operate are somewhat what we might call fragmented. That doesn't mean that they're not all serving an extremely amazing purpose. It means that we don't necessarily know what one another is doing, and that's one of the roles of this strategy. So we want to share research knowledge on what works among organizations, and we want to challenge stereotypes and build awareness of success. A research student who's working with me did these colorful and I think quite useful diagrams about the women's entrepreneurship strategy. So it's a Government of Canada strategy. The overall goal is to advance economic empowerment for women. They do have this objective of doubling the number of women-owned businesses by 2025. And there's 4 elements here that make up this strategy. So the WEKH is one element, the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. Okay, so this hub has 9 and possibly 10 regional hubs, currently 9. that each are collecting data and learning about good practice and trying to provide new resources and new linkages within their provinces and their regions. And you'll see those hubs listed there. I am co-leading the Manitoba hub at the Asper Business School. We have Professor Tanya Saba here, who is leading the hub in Quebec, and I think there are probably several others of you who I'm missing right now, but who may be here. So Wendy has been crisscrossing the country with other partners in the system, having meetings at the different hubs, having roundtables like this, starting to generate the questions. What are the most important questions that we can answer in terms of those 6 goals that I just showed you, which are really mandated by the government. So those goals are mandated. We have a responsibility to pursue and really show action on those goals within 6 years. So a big thing about this strategy is that, unlike the academic funding that we often depend on, which is through the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, this funding is through Innovation, Science and Economic Development of the federal government. And our commitment in the hubs was to contribute resources to this funding as well at the universities and the other schools here that are the regional heads, so that the work of the hub can be sustained over 6 years rather than 3, which would be probably a more normal time span for this mandate. So in Manitoba, just as a very quick example of what the hubs are doing, we're working with many organizations in Manitoba, and the work has started to get off the ground. We've had a roundtable there. We now in Manitoba have the headquarters of WEKH, and Alison is here, Kirkland, who is the new CEO of the Women's Enterprise Organizations of Canada. So some of their sub-organizations and many others that support women are people that we're talking to, and I'm kind of proud just vicariously that Manitoba is now going to be the heart of some of those activities, also through this funding, but not through the same envelope of funding that we're using. So collect, analyze, and disseminate data, assess and share best practices, benchmark and report. So we need to report regularly on what we're finding, right? All right. So the WEKH is, of course, led by Ryerson under Wendy Sucur's visionary and courageous and really undaunted leadership. There's the names of the regional hubs, and we have a presence coast to coast and as well in both official languages. In Manitoba and elsewhere, we're also very dedicated to working with Indigenous women's organizations and Indigenous women themselves, and we'll have a key person who will be spearheading that for us and also operating nationally with partners. So the research strategy is to synthesize existing knowledge because, as I mentioned, there's a lot of knowledge out there. There's a lot of good practice, amazing practice out there. We need to synthesize it and gather it and know what we know, okay? And then we also need to identify gaps and questions that flow from that. We want to examine what works to drive inclusion, practical strategies at the macro, mezzo, and micro levels. So I believe that on the opening of this conference, Wendy showed you the ecological model for change in diversity and inclusion. This is very much an ecosystem-based model. I'll show you another picture of it in a moment. But we very much believe that action has to be taken at all levels of analysis. So it's quite a tall order, but without that integrated action, we won't get real change. Documenting and celebrating women entrepreneurs and their stories along with our partners and other folks who are working on this, and benchmarking and developing a framework for assessing progress. So this work has begun, the evaluative framework, and I think Wendy's going to be talking about it further this morning. The critical piece, right, a critical piece. We really have to be able to measure what we're doing and where the progress is and where it's needed. Here's some of the partners. wonderful array of committed partners, which was very important for this funding and for the success of this whole project. Magnet is the digital platform that I mentioned, and I think you will be hearing more about that this afternoon. Okay, it's very powerful. It's designed to match relevant and timely export events and opportunities to Canadian businesses of all sizes. So this is also going to be used as a tool with WEKH. So what do we know already? Briefly, because I'm really introducing you to this hub rather than going into great detail on the research. So 16% of small and medium-sized enterprises in Canada, defined as small businesses with at least one employee, are operated, owned by women, 16% only. When we talk about self-employment, the number jumps to 37%. So right here we see that there could be an issue with definitions around what is entrepreneurship. So self-employed women, these 16% of businesses are more likely to focus on retail services and accommodation services. The research shows, and this is a very shorthand bullet point that really explains a big body of research, women are sometimes driven by necessity. That is why they go into entrepreneurship, especially in contexts where there are fewer supports for women in general in the policy system. So women are sometimes driven by necessity, but most cite opportunity as the driver. And women and other groups face barriers in funding, in gaining capital. This is a fairly large body of work as well. And I know that the future speakers right after me and later this morning are going to be addressing some of this. What are the barriers that women face? The research is quite robust. Previous recommendations, there have been recommendations made, and here are some of them, and some of these have been acted upon. So things like having female-friendly curriculum in entrepreneurship, program evaluation, good coordination and support and information, promoting entrepreneurship as an option for women, so letting them know that they have that option and trying to encourage them in that direction, increasing access to federal procurement, and internationalizing support. So some of the World Trade Centers in different cities around Canada are really working hard to increase knowledge and recognition of export opportunities that exist, trying to help women scale their businesses. So, so there are several recommendations have been made in the past, and we need to continue to push on several of these. But what WEKH is saying is that, we need to go a little bit further and take a systems approach to change, which really looks across all of these supports and tries to integrate them. Women in entrepreneurship, so why is this so necessary? Here are a few examples. Women in entrepreneurship programs in universities or colleges or technical institutes traditionally have been seen as add-ons and do not address the systemic barriers that do exist for women. And there's little evaluation of impact. And again, Wendy's going to go through quite a lot of this, so I'm just introducing you to a few of those themes. So this is what a systems approach looks like. This is how we've tried to map it for WEKH. The pink here is the individual level of analysis. So, what drives women? What are their skill levels? Those are questions we can ask about individuals. The blue level is really organizational, and there's a lot going on in that part of the ecosystem. So the business networks that exist that to help women and to make ties among women entrepreneurs, the support organizations that are doing amazing work for women, the innovating companies themselves, the colleges and universities, and the venture incubators and others that are contributing to this. So that's the organizational level of the ecosystem, and then there's the societal level, of course, which is very, very important in terms of driving what people think and perceive about women in entrepreneurship, right? So the discourses that really shape our environment, that shape people's choices and opportunities in the system. And also, of course, at this macro level, we have the policymakers, the governments, right? Very, very important. We have the labor market, we have globalization, we have these macro trends that affect what we can do and what we're not able to do. Building the incubation pipeline, so this is a slide that we like to show because what we would like to see at the, soon within this WEKH work and with all of the partners, and certainly towards the mid-range and the end of our practice, is support systems for women that go right through the funnel. So right to the scaling and the sustaining of businesses, and not focused solely at the startup stage, which is a very important stage, and gaining that access to capital is a very important stage. But really we want to see the similar support and lack of barriers right through to the scaling and sustaining. So definitions matter, and we talked a lot yesterday about tech and about STEM for entrepreneurs. Those are, important sectors, but by no means do they define entrepreneurship. By no means do they define innovation. So we've put up the UN sustainability goals there, sustainable development goals. Entrepreneurship can exist and can be measured. Its impact can be measured through many of these goals. And here are some traditional definitions of entrepreneurship that still stand, but they do show that this is not only about STEM or tech. Now, just relatively briefly on stereotypes, because this will be one area where we do a deep dive into trying to advance the research a little bit and collect some of the data that already exists. So stereotypes of women, and this came up in our conversations yesterday, and stereotypes of entrepreneurs themselves do affect women's choices at the individual level. So they do affect the intention of women to go into entrepreneurship. They do affect career preferences, and they do affect how new businesses are evaluated by the evaluators. So these biases, implicit biases, and stereotypes that decision makers and all of us have in our heads to one level or another at the individual level do affect women's choices in this area. I just want to read you, so I have a research student who looked at all this literature on stereotyping and how it affects entrepreneurship. Just in a couple of sentences, this is how she synthesized the findings. Okay. So gender stereotypes impact the leadership aspirations of girls starting at a young age and follow them into the workforce. Stereotypes impact the way women see themselves and the way that others see them. When investors, clients, suppliers, and employers view women with a gender lens, women have to work harder than men to achieve the same opportunities, respect, and success as men. Societal and organizational changes are needed to impact the rates of stereotyping and implicit bias, sometimes explicit, against women. So that's a synthesis. I liked her hard-hitting language there. It was very direct, and that's the result of an in-depth, detailed search of the literature and the research. We could say that this is fact, right? Okay. So this is a very quick kind of Google search to see, what comes into people's heads, or Google's head anyway, when you enter the word entrepreneur. And it takes quite some time until you get to a woman, right? So this idea of think entrepreneur, think male is real. and we see many famous faces there, and they're all male, almost all male. Takes a while before you get to a woman. Okay, you can try it yourself. It's quite telling. Okay, so stereotypes at the corporate or organizational level, these affect those folks who fund entrepreneurship, venture capitalist views towards women entrepreneurs. And there is research, a recent study that shows, for example, that if women talk about social impacts of their ventures, that is more likely to be viewed favorably by funders, right? And the same does not go for men, but if women are disadvantaged vis-a-vis men at the get-go, but if they talk about social impact, which is really a stereotype notion around women, they're more likely to be funded. So immigrant entrepreneurs, some racialized minorities, and other designated groups face compounding barriers in accessing enterprise services and support. And there's limited collaboration. What our look across this is telling us is that we could increase the collaboration between the organizations that support these different groups and the mainstream funders. So the next step, so continue to consult with key stakeholders, the ecosystem leaders in each region. This is very, very important. Collect and share existing research, launch our new portal, the Magnet portal. Work to apply the diversity assessment tool, which some of you are familiar with, to key stakeholders. So we have some projects, for example, around some key incubators to really look at their diversity practices right through the value chain. Assess what works overall and identify leading practices, and most of all, or not last but not least, share this information widely so it's of broad use to all the actors in the system. Thank you very much.